Welcome to the Embrace the Echo Grief Talks. It's a podcast where we delve into the depths of grief, exploring its complexities, unraveling its misconceptions, and navigating its winding path with compassion and understanding. I'm your host, Shay, and I invite you to join us in this journey through loss and healing.
Grief, a word heavy with emotion, yet often misunderstood. It's a journey that each of us will inevitably embark upon at some point in our lives, yet it remains a topic in misconceptions and societal taboos. But here and Embrace the Echo, we believe that grief deserves to be heard, acknowledged, and embraced.
And in this space, we'll explore the echoes of grief, the lingering whispers of memories, the echoes of love that reverberate long after loss, and together we'll confront the myths and misunderstandings surrounding grief, unraveling the tangled threads of societal expectations and personal experiences.
So let's embark on this journey together as we embrace the echo of grief, dispelling misconceptions and fostering empathy, connection, and understanding along the way.
I'm Shay, and with my co-host Ate Stephanie, this is Embrace the Echo Grief Talks. Let's begin. We have a lot of misconceptions about that we need to dispel and debunk, right? So, ready ka na, Ate Steph?
Let's go!
So, one common misconception is that grief follows a linear path. Can you explain why this is a myth and how grief actually unfolds?
Living with an open heart means loss. It could be of a loved one, or of a friend, or of a relationship, dream, a pet, or an artist, or even an author. Lived experience of grief isn't just one line. And of all, it still is that pain of loss. For every beginning comes an end, right? And understanding the in-between, because it is of value to one person. The only way out of it is through it. I remember you said that a while ago.
Thank you, Ate. Yung 5 stages, if you recall, yung Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she defined the 5 stages of grief. Oh my gosh, just from the top of my head, if I remember. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, I think. Oh my gosh, I don't know if that's correct. But hindi niya inintend to actually create it as a linear path. Like, after denial that you're gonna have to go through anger. I think for me, what I've experienced was that it's back and forth. I may have a sense of denial, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, okay, I guess I can accept the fact na they're not here anymore, that I'm not pregnant anymore, and then I go back to being upset about the idea of what happened. So it's really up and down and backwards and forwards, right? So
the idea that grief should be kept private or hidden prevalent in many cultures. How does this stigma surrounding grief hinder healing?
So I wanted to share this quote from Dr. Edith Eger. Again, I mentioned her earlier in our first few episodes. She's a psychologist, and she deals with people who experience trauma and grief. And she's also a Holocaust survivor. She said that you can't heal what you don't feel. So as a society, if we keep our grief hidden or not talk about grief in the open, it will remain as a taboo subject. And guess what? If that continues, then the stigma will continue, and that will hinder the healing of our grief. In this podcast, we aim to change that, to challenge the norm, to normalize the grief, and really bring insights and light to people's stories. And by doing so, we can help facilitate healing that grief. And it definitely takes a certain understanding and empathy to witness another person's grief. The hope is that in the future, we can collectively speak about grief with a much better understanding and openness in order to support the healing journey of everyone's grief. So this stigma can actually further delay the natural grieving process. It would lead to people suppressing their emotions because they fear judgment, criticism, shame, feeling the sense of rejection. So for example, I remember some people had expressed that growing up, they were told to be strong, don't cry, or don't be upset. You're still talking about that, or are you not over it yet? After dealing a loss. So instead, they deny themselves to feel it because society dictates it. And this can also lead to further isolation and loneliness, as we spoke about in the first few episodes, right? I remember feeling so lonely, as the grief I felt after a losses was something that not most people I know can relate to. I stayed home and just avoided being with other people. I felt unsafe with other people unless I knew they were open to hearing my story. And that's the time when I actually start to seek professional to help and attend support groups. They were my refuge. It was a safe space where where I was not judged, and I felt less lonely hearing other people's story in the support group. So yeah,
It really does make a difference when you feel safe.
Yeah.
Because that was my issue before in the past. I had to deny everything because I never felt safe or comfortable.
It stems from that, right? For someone who's experienced a traumatic grief, it was traumatic because, I was in the verge of life and death, being in a position where I was in a dilemma, having to choose whether to save myself or the baby was very conflicting. So it's really, I felt unsafe in my own body, that my body is able to parang, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to pretty much abort this baby to terminate the pregnancy, especially for Josh. So it's something, the sense of safety is really necessary for us who's experienced such traumatic experience. There's often pressure to move on or get over grief quickly. How does this expectation contribute to the misunderstanding of grief?
I can't seem to evade the thought of always thinking about my experience. But grief and loss is complex. Moving on doesn't mean the end of grief either. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. Ultimately, you get to define moving on for yourself. Some people can move on in 6 months, in a year, in 5 years, or 20 years. Who is to say? We are not responsible for how others feel about our process to our grief. No one is to say how we heal, how to do it. To learn to understand the self is important above all else. It's valid, you are valid. No one can ever tell you otherwise.
That's right. You gotta do you. You gotta do you. At the end of the day, it's our life that we're living, right? So sometimes it's really hard to live within the expectation of others, especially within a culture where that's the pressure, right? Like we have to conform because this is what culture told us to grieve the way we're supposed to. But really, what's happening, and if we listen to them and not listen to our internal needs of how we should grieve, how our body's telling us to grieve, like really denying ourselves that. And then for me, it's like self-betrayal. I'm like, why am I denying this thing that I feel so passionately about? So yeah, yun lang yung thoughts ko.
Some may view expressions of grief, such as crying or talking about the deceased, as a sign of weakness. How can we change that misconception?
So for me, who expresses a lot of my emotions through tears and talking, I think both you and I can relate to that. I can relate to this question very well. This misconception of crying and talking as a sign of weakness is not true. In fact, crying is something that's innate within us. Crying is a way to communicate. Just remember how a baby would cry to communicate to their parents that they were hungry or the need to be comforted, right? And generally communicate their needs in general. So same thing with grief. When we experience intense emotions and tears starts to flow, it's actually our body's natural way of releasing that internal tension and the stress hormones. The tears are quite powerful, as oftentimes when I have so much pent-up emotions, the release of those tears are enough to express the things that cannot be expressed through words. And now, as my crying may be lessened, I now have words to express it as I navigate my grief. And here we are talking and normalizing grief talks. For me, I think it's quite a healing journey to be able to get to where I am now. And again, to journey that with you, is really of value to my healing journey as well. So I'm also learning as I hear your story and inspiring me to like, you know what, you're 20 years in, even though you've taken this time, there's so much things that we can learn from your experiences and how you've pushed through ways na maybe you may find that you cope unhealthily, but look at you where you are here now. And, I can look up to you and say, you know what, I commend you for being, that brave person. So, and same thing, for this point, I wanted to also share a quote by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. He shared that your capacity to share tears is an indication of your willingness to do the essential healing work of mourning. I made it a homework to meet one person every month outside of my house to be with that safe person, whether that be to meet them at a restaurant or at a park or somewhere. It's just to touch base, and I know this person can sit with my pain, and I've trusted them with that story. I've learned to cry in public spaces, and I didn't care, and I don't care. I think I've had enough to parang push it down. I had so much tears. In fact, I thought I was gonna run out of it. I guess I was getting dehydrated to the point where it's just too much. Like the salt from my tears are really wearing my skin out as well. I just give myself the permission to allow that tears to flow and really talking about my grief in the story. And it's made so much ease of that burden to carry once you cry it out.
That's true. Now I can relate to that. I mean, 20 years in, and it's only now I'm starting to unfold that grief that I hid, so. Yeah.
Many people believe that grief has a specific timeline or expiration date. How does this belief affect those who are grieving?
Well, grief is a process. It can be different to all. Some may be similar, but still always a different stroke of the story. In the grieving process, we have to understand the relationship with the person that died, how they died, not just of that certain person, but other things, Being isolated, meaning not validated in our loss, that can lead to persistent grief or complicated grief. To process that is an authentic story. To some, it took them, like I said a while ago, it could take some 6 months. It's a process that people need to go through. It's not a race. Realistically, it may seem that they've healed, but what it really is that they come to learn how to cope with their new normal, their reality, nurturing the continued bond of memories of the loved ones. Grieving never really stops, actually. It's just to grow around the loss and with time, learn to carry it in a way that it is manageable. There's this other common myth is that time heals all wounds. Can you discuss why this oversimplification of grief is problematic?
Time alone doesn't heal wounds. And the same idea that time alone doesn't heal grief, right? So this common myth that time heals all wounds is something that I want to challenge as well. In fact, I can relate to this myth or this misconception just within my own professional work, that I do being a wound care specialist, seeing various types of causes of wounds. Like I'm talking about physical wounds, okay? Yung physical wounds that people develop in their bodies, whether that's be through a pressure ulcer or surgical wounds and, diabetic foot ulcers. I can go on and on, but that's like work that I do professionally. So time alone just simply is not enough to heal a wound. So from superficial wounds to deep wounds from various causes, we learn to understand that we need to not just patch it with the dressing. We don't just put a Band-Aid on it and then there you go, it's going to heal. No. It doesn't work like that. But what we do as professionals, we look at the person as a whole. We look at the root cause of it. We provide the wound a healing environment where it can thrive to heal. And we're not just looking at just that one whole. We're looking at the person as a whole being, right? So we look at very similar to healing grief, the wounds associated with grief requires a dedicated time just in understanding what grief is like and how it affects a person's emotional, physical, cognitive, social, and spiritual aspect. It means that the person will be learning how to navigate from those every aspects of their grief in order to heal. So it's not as simple as just give it time or you just let time pass. I mean, yes, time will continue to pass. At one point, I felt like I was stuck and the time kept moving. It's just not as simple as that. Grief is complex, and how humans are so complex and complicated. So everyone has their own specific needs that they will have to navigate to in order to heal and reconcile with that grief. So the person grieving, along with time, will need to navigate their grief in a safe space with a community that will show compassion, understanding, and empathy, an intended expression, an active work of mourning to deliver and process the losses, to understand and learn how to give themselves that self-compassion and self-love in the midst of their own struggles. It's a big thing for me, self-love and self-compassion. I thought I knew compassion was because I was in this nursing field, a profession that, you give compassion to your patients, to your clients, realizing that I didn't know how to give that to myself. It was a huge realization that, I thought I knew compassion, but I didn't know how to give that to myself. What's something I needed to learn? That I'm human too, that also I deserve the love that I give to others to give to myself, right? So it can also be learning to challenge their own belief system, that may be hindering us from moving forward, or those that no longer serves us, right? So with all of that work, comes with personal growth and journey to healing, integrating that grief or healing that wound. So with that being said, this whole misconception that time heals all wounds is not true. It's it's the time and what you do with the time. Right? Will determine the healability of those wounds. And same thing with grief. That's that. So I think that was our last question. And again, I really, really enjoyed this conversation. We can talk more. I'm sure people will be commenting. But as we reach the end of this episode, it's clear that the misconceptions about grief are deeply rooted in our society, impacting the way we navigate loss and support those who are grieving.
Absolutely. And it's been enlightening to challenge these myths, to explore the diverse and complex nature of grief. It's a reminder that each person's journey is unique and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes, so grief is often misunderstood, but through our conversations today, we've aimed to unravel some of these misconceptions and provide a more empathetic perspective.
Remember, it's okay not to have all the answers when it comes to supporting someone who is grieving. What's important is showing up and listening and being present.
Indeed. So let's continue to foster open conversations about grief, dispelling myths, and creating a space where individuals feel heard and understood.
Thank you for joining us. We hope this conversation encourages reflection and empathy in your own life and relationships.
And until next time, please take care of yourselves and each other. My name is Shay, and with my co-host, Ate Stephanie, we are signing off from Embrace the Echo Grief Talks. Bye.
Bye.